share with you this evening the life of one of the saints we heard mentioned in the services this evening, St. Job of Pochav. And I'd like to share with you some excerpts from an article entitled The Iron Stance of St. Job of Pochav. In the lands of northern Ternopil region, now western Ukraine, was the famous monastic saint who stood against the Unia as against apostasy, against the betrayal of orthodoxy, St. Job of Pochav, who lived 100 years, and who was called in the world before monasticism John Zalezo. Today, we celebrate the memory of this saint who stood like an iron wall for Russian Orthodoxy. Let us not forget that the territory of what is now Western Ukraine had in 1596 accepted what is known as the Brest Unia, which meant the union with the Roman Catholic Church by a number of bishops and dioceses of the Orthodox Kievan Metropolia, at the time under the Constantinople Patriarch, headed by the Kiev Metropolitan Michael Ragoza on the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But St. Job of Pochav, the abbot of the Pochav Lavra, stood unwavering in his faith, and with iron steadfastness struggled against the Unians who had left orthodoxy for the protection of the Roman Pope. St. Job was strong in spirit and faith, and it is not in vain that such multitudes of people from all over the world come today to his holy relics, which lie in a reliquary near the cave where he prayed on the Pochav hill. It pleased God to show forth in western Ukraine this man who pleased him during the hour of great and terrible trials that crashed down upon the Orthodox in those regions. Here is what Metropolitan Isaiah Kopinski wrote in 1632 to the Moscow Patriarch. There are no pious princes, noble dignitaries have disappeared. Everyone has left from Eastern Orthodoxy to the West, and one could hardly find a man among the poor and inglorious who have remained pious in the Orthodox faith. It was precisely those poor and inglorious, the peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and clergy, who were faced with the struggle against the Jesuit influence, which was particularly active in those times. St. Job of the Pochav monastery became the strong spiritual backbone, the symbol of this struggle. The saint lived during difficult times for Russia, when on its western borders, the Orthodox people of Volhynia and Galicia were subjected to cruel ecclesiastical and political oppression from the Polish-Lithuanian magnates. St. Job witnessed the Brest Unia and the implacable Catholic invasion that followed it, as well as the growth of Protestant influence. As the abbot of the monastery, he had enormous spiritual authority, and he used all of his resources to strengthen orthodoxy, to struggle with the heterodox and heretic influences on the people's consciences. The future saint was born in Pokutia in Galicia to the pious Ivan and Agafia Zalezo, who belonged to a noble family and who remained faithful to orthodoxy. From the saint's life, which was written by his disciple, Saint Dositheos, we know that from the age of 10, Ivan, or John, left the sight of his beloved parents and came to the Ugornitz Holy Transfiguration Monastery in the Carpathian Mountains, where after 2 years he was given the small schema with the name Job. Much later, apparently not long before his repose, the exact date is not known, he received the great schema. The ascetic's labors of prayer and pious life were not hidden from the people. His fame spread throughout the entire region. Even dignitaries began coming to the saint, asking for spiritual nourishment. He began to enjoy the particular trust and protection of the famous defender of orthodoxy, Prince Constantine Ostrogski. Prince Constantine made a request to the abbot of the Ugornitz monastery to release St. Job to the Dubinsk monastery of the Holy Cross, located on his princely estate. The abbot consented, and after some time, Job was made the abbot of the Dubinsk Brotherhood. He remained in the rank of abbot for over 20 years, and it is during that time that the Brest Unia was signed, followed by oppression of the Orthodox. Prince Constantine, under whose protection St. Job was, had enormous influence in Volhynia. He enjoyed the respect of the Polish king Sigismund III and Pope Clement VIII of Rome. Therefore, the Uniates and Jesuits did not dare to get in the way of the Dubinsk abbot's work. During his time in the Dubinsk, the saint set about disseminating Orthodox books. With this aim, he engaged certain people in translation work and the copying of books. According to his life, the saint himself participated in these labors. At the saint's blessing, from 1581 to 1582, Prince Constantine published in Ostrog the first printed Slavic Bible, which is well known to historians and literary scholars throughout the world as the Ostrog Bible. The cares and worries that go along with publishing work, as well as the Latins' dislike of this process, distracted St. Job from his monastic labors. The Dubinsk monastery enjoyed 20 years of the saint's abbacy, but burdened by his disobedience, he left that community around 1604. Yearning for the ascetic labors of a desert dweller, he found refuge in a modest community not far away on the Pochav hill, where a great army of hesychasts had lived from ancient times. St. Job sought obscurity and freedom for prayer in the Pochav monastery, but the monks, who most likely sensed great spiritual strength in the anchorite, unanimously and tearfully begged him to become their abbot. The saint was forced to give in, and soon, through his labors, the Pochav monastery was strengthened and rose above all other Western Russian monasteries. He began to receive material support from the local nobility who had avoided falling into the Unia. Thus, in 1649, financed by the noble family of Theodore and Eve, a stone church was built in the monastery that was dedicated to the Holy Trinity. The imprint in stone of the healing foot of the Mother of God, along with her miracle-working Pochav icon, were placed in that church. But soon, disaster came. In 1607, the Tartars attacked the monastery, plundered it, and killed one of the monks. In 1620, the grandson of Anna Goyskaya, the Protestant Andrei Firli, took it into his head to kick the monks off the Pochav hill, and to this end robbed them of their lands. He broke into the monastery with his servants and stole the miraculous icon. After this, Firli's household was stricken with catastrophes and sickness, which did not cease until the icon was returned to the monastery. These events forced St. Job into time-consuming and laborious work. Over the course of several years, he had to travel to courts and agencies until the suit with Firli was finally decided in favor of the monastery. As a result of huge efforts, a well was dug on the Pochav hill so that the monastery could have water. The neighboring sources had been taken away by Firli. Especially important for strengthening orthodoxy in Volhynia were the saint's book publishing and literary activities. At the beginning of the 17th century, in this region there remained only one Slavic printing press, the one in Pochav. St. Job used it for the struggle with the heterodox. Here, books were published of an expository and dogmatic nature, and Orthodox prayers and epistles were also published, especially important in those conditions of Catholic expansion in Western Rus. For many years, up until 1932, the Pochav monastery has kept the work of the saint himself, the book of the Blessed Job of Pochav, written with his authoritative hand, containing up to 80 discourses, teachings, sermons, and notes taken from patristic, ascetical, and polemical works. published in 1884 in Kiev in the Russian language under the title The Bee of Pochav. The most important thing for the elder was the struggle with Catholics and with Protestant sects. The saint was present at the Kiev Council in 1628, called in connection with the return to Orthodoxy from Archbishop Meletius, who had fallen into Uniatism. It was St. Job who wrote the council ruling that testified to faithfulness to Eastern Orthodoxy. Along with his visible labors, in the saint's life were the unseen labors of prayer. St. Job finally found his solitude in the wild cave on the Pochav hill. This cave was very narrow and tiny. Within it he poured out many heartfelt tears for the world that lies in evil, as St. Dositheos expressed it in the life that he wrote. The saint would remove himself to the cave for a whole week and pray for the world there, fasting strictly. Thou did many times enclose thyself in a narrow rock cave for the sake of divine contemplation, says the Troparion in the fourth tome to St. Job. It was not granted to any mortal to know what was done in those hours in the cave. But one day, while the saint was praying there, an extraordinary light suddenly shone around the cave, and for the span of 2 hours was reflected from its depths upon the church opposite it. Whoever has been vouchsafed to spend time in the cave church of the Pochav monastery, where are the reliquaries with the relics of the pillars of Pochav, Saints Job and Amphilochius, will recall the awe that seizes you when you incline your heart and soul to this place, to the honorable relics of the spirit-bearing elders who lived 300 years apart and who stood on the spiritual boundaries of Orthodox Rus. What the famous Russian writer and pilgrim A.N. Muraviev wrote is true, that the primary history of the Pochav hills should be sought out not in the heights of the cliffs, but in the depths of the caves. St. Job's relics are kept with great honor and reverent care. The beautifully adorned reliquary with the relics of St. Job stands within the natural cave, next to the crawl space leading into the saint's cave, where he spent so many hours and days in prayer and vigil. In the cave are massive stone arches made of gray, unhewn stone, and right there is a small but rich iconostasis, lampadas, candles, the relics of the saint. The relics are covered with glass, but not completely. The hands of the incorrupt relics are uncovered, and the faithful reverently kiss them as if the righteous man were alive. The saint's hands, incorrupt even as though he reposed many centuries ago, are today still warm and soft, as if living, and a wondrous fragrance exudes from them. Those who wish can climb through to the saint's cave and pray there. There is an oral tradition that this crawl space has the wondrous quality of freely allowing people pass through who are pure of heart, humble and repentant, but those who are unrepentant get caught and can't leave until they repent before everyone of their sins. Whoever has dived, literally dived head first and downward into the tiny little cave in a small opening in the cliff, which seems to be no larger than 2 fists, will never forget it. At first, you can't even understand how a grown man could crawl through it. But when you climb through, you'll find yourself in total darkness. Your breathing is interrupted. Your chest tightens when you crawl into the darkness, and your heart starts pounding from the unknown and wants to jump out of this cavity. An unseen servant supports you inwardly. You feel your way to the icon, touch it with your lips, collect yourself with difficulty, and say 3 prayers. There is such a prayerful feeling in St. Job's little cave, as if you had fallen into the Lord's right hand and he has gripped you like a piece of cheese, squeezing out everything extraneous and returning you once again to the real world. It is a direct, full, and clear sensation that you have stood before the face of the Lord. Besides prayer and divine contemplation, the saint also occupied himself with physical labor. He worked in the monastery orchard and helped dig 2 ponds near the monastery with dams. During the military campaign against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, St. Job gave many people refuge in his monastery. It is also known that the saint was chosen as a father confessor by many influential people of those times. All the way up until 1649, St. Job served as abbot and named his successor only when he was 98 years old. However, even after that, he participated in the more important events of the monastery. On October 21st, 1651, the saint received a revelation that he would soon depart. On October 28th, he served divine liturgy and then peacefully departed to the Lord. The saint was buried near the cave where he had labored in asceticism. A wondrous radiance was often seen over his grave. 7 years after his repose, St. Job appeared 3 times in dreams to Metropolitan Dionysios of Kiev and informed him that the time had come to uncover his relics. His body had lain 7 years and 9 months in the earth after its burial. The uncovering of his relics happened like this. On August 28, 1659, Metropolitan Dionysios headed the triumphal uncovering of the incorrupt relics of the saint, upon which could even be seen the wounds on his feet from the swelling caused by his long standing in prayer. The life of St. Job says almost nothing about these wounds, but it is quite likely that his being named after righteous Job, the much suffering, in the small schema, is directly connected with this great patience that the saint had in enduring many sicknesses, his profound humility, and his prayerful labors of a style. Then the incorrupt relics of St. Job were translated into the Church of the Life-Creating Trinity. Many miracles occurred from them. For example, the fatally ill Dositheos, who wrote the saint's life, received healing. In 1675, through the prayers of the saint, the Mother of God saved the monastery from the Tartar and Turkish attacks. The Most Holy Theotokos appeared over the Pochav hill together with St. Job. The arrows shot at them by the enemy returned to the shooters and struck them. The Muslims fled in terror at this miracle. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Pochav monastery was taken over by the Uniates. But the miracles and healing did not cease to flow from St. Job's relics. Even the Uniates came to believe in his sanctity, composed a service to him with an akathist, and requested of the Roman Pope that he be canonized, a request that was rejected due to the saint's zeal for holy orthodoxy. In 1831, the Pochav monastery returned to the Russian Church. Miraculous healings inspired the Holy Synod to open the relics a second time, which took place on August 28, 1833. Note that the dates of the first and second uncoverings match. In 1858, a new church was built on the cave site and dedicated to St. Job. The akathist to St. Job says, "O our all-blessed and God-bearing Father Job, instructor in the monastic angelic way of life, unconquerable defender of and struggler for the Eastern Orthodox Catholic faith against the falsely minded West, faithful observer and strict upholder of the God-inherited rules of the Church and patristic inheritance, great zealot of holiness and purity, chastity and non-acquisitiveness, love of labor and divine contemplation, fasting and vigil, tireless and invincible struggler of long-suffering and patient endurance, icon of meekness, mirror of humility, example of guilelessness, support of fasters, praise of virgins, joy of monks and schema monks, protect us with thy prayers from all enemy attacks and evil circumstances. Preserve and keep each and all in peace and tranquility, in unfeigned faith and a God-pleasing life." The Holy Dormition Pochav Monastery received the status of a lavra much later after the sacred struggles of St. Job, and to this day, the Pochav lavra stands as a stronghold of Russian Orthodoxy amidst lands that have been ceaselessly subjected to Greek Catholic invasions, and it does not give in. We should all learn from the steadfastness and inviolability placed at the foundation of this stand of John Zaleza, St. Job of Pochav. Holy Father Job, pray to God for us.
Amen.
Amen.